Hey traders, welcome back to another lesson. In this lesson, we're going to be breaking down the built-in TradingView AutoFib tool. So this tool right here is automatically detecting a pivot point, like an impulsive move in the market, and it is drawing the Fibonacci ratios between the high and low of that move. And it's a pretty cool tool. We're going to break down the source code to it, how it works. Now, it's a pretty fleshed out script. It has quite a lot of options here. You can turn on and off several, well over a dozen Fibonacci levels. I've simplified the script a bit. I've turned off a bunch of the Fibonacci levels by default, and we're only working with some of the more popular Fibonacci ratios. Before we start, I should mention that the way I got the source code to this script is I just added the AutoFib retracement script to my chart. So this is the built-in automatic Fibonacci tool that the TradingView developers created. If I open up the source code by clicking on this little source code button here, this is what the source code looked like when I first saw it. It's not a lot of commenting here. It's pretty dense code, but it does the job. And so I copy and pasted all of this code into my Pine editor and just made some small adjustments to make the code a little bit easier to read, a little bit tidier. And I commented some of the sections of code, changed some of the function names because they weren't very intuitive to me personally, and I just organized the code a little bit better. So let's start breaking down the source code. First up, we have a whole bunch of user inputs. I'm not going to go over all of these. They're pretty simple to understand. If I open up the settings here, we have our deviation. So this is a multiplier that affects how much price should deviate from the previous pivot point in order for the bar to become a new pivot. Now, we haven't covered pivots yet in the course, but I will create a lesson on that when I get around to it. In this lesson, we'll touch on pivots a little bit, as the script code here depends on automatic detection of pivot points for determining which price values to draw the fib between. So by default, it's set to 3 deviations. So this affects how the script detects its price points. So if we increase this, now you can see it's detecting bigger swings in the market. But it's set to 3 by default, and I find that to work pretty well on most markets. The next setting here is depth. This is how many bars, the minimum number of bars that will be taken into account when calculating what price points are important for drawing the Fibonacci between. Then we have a bunch of visual options here. You can reverse the ratio. So if I click on that, now it's drawing from here down to here. If I turn off reverse, it's drawing in the direction of the impulsive move. So it's drawing the fib from the low up to the high in this particular case, but you can reverse that there if you want to. You can also extend the lines left and right. I turn these off by default to make it easy to see what the indicator is actually doing. You can also turn the prices on, and that will display the price values of each ratio. And I added a little option here called delete last line. If I turn that off, you can see that the script is now displaying previous pivots, previous impulsive moves that it detected in historical price action. So this is the pivot points at play. This is showing how the script identifies pivot points, which levels it thinks are important. And you can turn that on or off in the settings menu. I added this option. It's not in the default inbuilt indicator. I just was curious to see how the script identified its swings. But this is turned on by default so that you don't see those previous lines. You only see the current line. Then you can turn the levels on or off, which will turn the text on or off, and you can change it to % if you want to, or values. Then we have our labels position left or right, and our background transparency. Then all of our fib levels here. So you can adjust the levels if you want to, and that will change where the lines draw. Anyway, that's the user inputs covered. Let's get into the code here. So the first thing we do is determine our extending parameter. So this is the extend left or extend right for our lines. We use this later on to tell the script whether or not to extend the lines left and right. The next thing we do is calculate the deviation threshold for identifying major swings in the market. So dev threshold is deviation threshold, and that is calculated by dividing the ATR over the past 10 bars by the closing price multiplied by 100 multiplied by our threshold multiplier, which is this setting here. And we use this later on to identify major swings in the market. The next thing we do is prepare our pivot variables. So these are for drawing and analyzing the pivots in price action and the line between them. The next thing we do is to create a custom function for detecting pivot points. So this pivots function takes a price source, a length, look back length, and whether or not it is a high. This function here returns some tuples, so two values. So the values it returns is either a bar index and a price value, or NA, a bar index NA or nothing, and a price value that's nothing, NA. So a float type of NA or an integer type of NA. Now let's hide the indicator just briefly and analyze what this code here is doing. Let's break it down. So down here is where this custom function is called. So this function returns two values, the bar index of the pivot point and the price of the pivot point. And it's passing in a high and a low. So it's getting swing high pivots and swing low pivots. It's passing in our depth value divided by 2. So that's this setting here, divided by 2. So it's passing in 5 by default. And then we have these two Boolean values here. This is for detecting high, swing high pivots or swing low pivots. If it's set to true, then it treats this code as if it's trying to analyze a price high. Otherwise, if this value here is false, then it's trying to calculate the pivot of a low, a swing low in price. The first thing this function does is it multiplies the length by 2 and then gets a price value over our look back period. So 5 bars by default. So let's analyze this bar right here. If I put a vertical line there, we divide our depth by 2. So we're looking back 5 bars by default. That's what this value here would give us. It would give us the high of this bar 5 bars ago. Then it creates a flag Boolean here called OK. Is this an OK pivot, a valid pivot? It's set to true. But then we have a for loop here that invalidates the pivot if certain conditions are met. So we loop over our look back period, this L2 variable, which is our length multiplied by 2. So this here would be our actual depth in the settings menu, because we pass in this value divided by 2. So we get half of this value. And then this L2 variable multiplies it by 2. And then in this for loop here, we loop up to our look back periods or our depth, so 10. So if we're analyzing this bar, we loop all the way back to this bar here. And then if we are analyzing swing highs for pivots, it checks if is high is true and the price source, so in this case, the high of this loop is greater than our price value in the middle here, then OK is set to false and this pivot is ignored. So what this code here is basically trying to do is identify a price action pattern that looks like this. So it takes several bars to identify the swing high either side of our midpoint. So if we have a 10 bar look back, which is this, 10 bars between these two lines, because it passes in depth divided by 2, this is the bar that it's analyzing as a swing high. And if this bar's high was higher than the high of this bar and the high of this bar, then this would be considered a valid pivot point. And then we also check the price deviation to make sure that it's a significant swing high or swing low and price has moved significantly from that swing high. And then it's obviously the same for swing lows, but opposite direction. So it's looking for this sort of pattern. And we have our midpoint and our current bar and the look back, our depth value. And it's looking for a pivot between those two candles. Anyway, moving on, we then get those values calling this custom function. So I already explained what these are. The index of the pivot high and the pivot high price, the index of the pivot low and the pivot low price. And when I say index, I mean the bar index, so the bar count for that pivot. The next thing we have here is another custom function that calculates the price deviation from or between two prices. So we have our base price and the price we want to analyze. We multiply the difference between these two prices divided by the price multiplied by 100. And that gives us our price deviation between these two values. And this is used for validating major swings in price action by analyzing this value here. The next custom function here is a custom function for detecting pivots that meet our deviation criteria. So we already have our function for detecting pivots. We get those pivot values. We also have a function for calculating the deviation between two price values. This function here basically updates the line between our pivots only if the pivot meets our criteria. So if I turn off this value here so that we can actually see all of the lines that are being drawn. So you can see that it's actually ignoring this swing high even though it's higher than this one. That's because of our deviation setting here. If I set this to 2, Now it's detecting this pivot as valid because this move here is now 2 deviations from the high, and it is considered a valid move in price. If we increase that deviation value, this move in here is no longer considered a big enough move to be valid. So depending on the market you're trading, you will need to play around with this deviation value to get the script to be more accurate. For now, I'll move this down to 2 so that we're getting a little bit more accurate pivot detection. But you can see through here when price contracted, because we're using the ATR in our calculation of calculating the deviation, it's now detecting a little bit more noise now that we've lowered that deviation value. If I increase that, now it's treating consolidation a little bit more accurately. But anyway, that is something you'll need to play around with. That is how the inbuilt AutoFib tool works in TradingView. It's not perfect. Nothing when it comes to identifying discretionary patterns, and impulsive moves in markets are discretionary patterns, because how you identify a impulsive move in the market depends very heavily on how you read markets. So is this a impulsive move? Is that a valid important pullback? Or is this a valid important pullback? Or is this whole move just one impulsive move? That is something that will differ between every trader, and every script that you write and all the parameters that you input into that script will affect how your script analyzes those pivot points. There is no black and white answer to what constitutes a valid impulsive move and a valid pivot. So it really is up to you how you define your parameters for detecting these moves. But anyway, moving on, let's break down the code for this function. This if statement here checks if we have a new pivot in the same direction as the last. And if we do, it updates the line. So I'll show you what this looks like in real time. For this, we'll use the bar replay tool. So if I put the bar replay tool on, let's do it here. So now you can see that the script is identifying this as a impulsive move. But if we cycle forward a little bit, once we get a valid deviation from this low, the line will update. So it will change from here to something more like this. So let's keep cycling forward. There we go. Now we've had a significant move up from this low. And so the line has updated from here all the way down to here. And this will continue to happen as price action develops. So if we go even further, now this is the line. And if we keep going even further, eventually we'll get that retracement. Here's the new price base, the new price low. Keep going, keep going. Now we have our impulsive move down to here, and the script is now detecting this as the next pivot. The whole time that this was happening, and this line kept updating in the same direction, the bearish direction. So if we go forward a little bit more, and you saw that line update just then, that's what this if statement here does. So if we have a new pivot in the same direction as the last pivot, then we update our line because we have trend continuation occurring. And to update the line, we use the line.setXY2 function. We pass in the last line, the line that we were already drawing, and then a new bar index. So that's the new bar index and the new price value. In this case, that would be a low. And that updates our line to reflect the new development in price action. And otherwise, if these conditions are not met, then we return a null or NA line and an NA Boolean value. Because we have had no valid pivot detected, so return nothing. And then this else statement says, if we do not have a pivot point in the same direction as the last, then we check, is the deviation significant? So does it exceed our deviation threshold? If so, the price move is significant and we have a new line. We need to create a new line between the pivot points. And if you have this turned on in the settings menu, then it would delete the previous line. So this line here. And so the easiest way to explain this bit of code here is to show you what it looks like on the charts. So that's what happens here. If we go forward a little bit further, one more bar, or a couple more bars. There we go. What you just saw there, this new line being drawn, is this else statement. We just had a significant move after a valid pivot was detected that was significant enough to overwrite the previous one. And now this is the new pivot that we are analyzing with our Fibonacci tool. And otherwise, if we detected a new pivot point and a new impulsive move that was below our deviation threshold, then we just return nothing. And we don't update the line at all. We do nothing. We wait for a more significant move in price action before we do anything. So that's what the pivot found function does. It's a bit difficult to explain the code here, but if you play around with this in your own time, edit the code a little bit, play around with some of these values, you'll get a feel for what this code is doing. But basically, it's either updating the line in the same direction or creating a new line when a new pivot is detected. Anyway, moving on, we then check if the bar index for the current pivot high is not NA, or in other words, we have a new pivot, a new valid pivot. Then we calculate the deviation from the last pivot high. So this code here is analyzing pivot highs. So any swing high that the script is analyzing is handled by this if statement. And then we get this tuple value here, the ID of our line, and the is high Boolean value. So we call our pivot found function here. We pass in the dev, which is used for calculating whether or not the pivot is a major swing in the market. We pass in this true Boolean value, which tells the function that we are analyzing highs, price highs. And then we pass in our index of the last high and the price value of the last high as well, so that we can analyze the new pivot against the old pivot. And then if our function here returns a valid line ID, so if the line is not NA, or in other words, if the line has been updated, then update the price values and delete the previous line. So this is our setting here. If I turn this on, you can see all of our lines just disappeared except for the last line on our chart that the script detected. So it deletes the last line and it updates all of our price values. So it updates the last line ID. It updates whether the last pivot was a swing high or a swing low. It passes in the last bar index that we analyzed. It passes in the previous index of the pivot and the current pivot value. It saves these two values. So that's this index and this index. And it saves the last price value. So this is analyzing swing highs, pivot highs. So PH is pivot high price value. That's this value up here. It saves all of those values into our VAR variables here. And the script just continually analyzes and updates these values when major pivots are detected. So next we have this else statement. And then this is exactly the same code here that we have here, but for swing lows. So if I unindent this, you can see that the code is identical, except that we are analyzing price lows instead of highs, or pivot lows instead of pivot highs. But in PineScript, if I were to save this, the script will not compile because the indentation is not correct. So we need to indent and tab all of this if statement in order to get our indentation compiling correctly. But all of this code here is doing exactly the same thing as this code, except for pivot lows. Anyway, moving on, we then have another custom function here that draws our fib lines. And this function takes two parameters, a price value or a Fibonacci price value and a color value. And then it just creates a new line at the current bar index. And it draws this line from the last bar index of a pivot to the current bar index. And it just draws a horizontal line between these two price values, which is our Fibonacci ratio. And then it also assigns its extending parameter. So if I turn extend right on, now the line, the extend value here is set to extend right. But I'm going to turn that off so that's a little bit easier to see what the script is currently doing. So here it updates the line if it already exists. Otherwise, if the line does not already exist, then it just returns the new line ID. And then next up, we have our custom function for drawing the labels, the text labels on our Fibonacci tool. It takes a price value to draw out a text value and a text color value. So this code here just basically checks where the label position is set to. And then we use the line.get bar index. The x1 and x2 values in a line is the bar index. So if the label position is set to left, it gets the x1 value, which is this bar index here, and it draws the text to the left of this bar. Otherwise, if label position is set to right, then it draws it to the right of the last bar index, or the x2 value of our line here. But I'll set that back to left. And then if our label position is set to left, we set the label style to style label right. Otherwise, we set it to style label left. So if we set this to right, now this is drawn to the right. And then we set our line parameter based on whether we have selected left or right here. If we've selected left, then we align the text to the right. Otherwise, we align it to the left. That's just to keep the text closer to our drawing tools here. And then we have a couple of strings here that have a bunch of blank spaces. That's what this little red character with the white dot in it is. If we scroll up to the top here, you can see them here as well. These are like forced spaces in the string. I'm not sure what character this is. You see this quite often in a lot of the inbuilt TradingView indicators, especially in the settings menu. Pi encoders tend to use this character to help format their text. So you can see here that there's a space between this character, this line character. If I were to just replace this with 4 spaces and save the code, now when I open up the settings menu, you can see that that space is gone because PineScript gets rid of any white space in your strings when drawing onto the chart or into the settings menu. And so if you want those spaces to not be trimmed from your string, you need to use this strange red character with the white dot. I'm not sure what this character is or how you even get it, but you can just copy and paste this into any scripts you want to use it in, and it will have the same effect. If you want to play around with this source code and you don't want the numbers drawing above the line like they are here, and you prefer them to draw in line with the line, then just delete these special characters. Anyway, the next thing we do here is create a new label with all of these values passed in to the parameters. The label also has a color of black with 100% transparency. So that's why you can't see any label color in the background. Normally you would see a colored label behind the text. By setting it to this value, it's basically just full transparency on a black color, and so it doesn't draw any label background. And that's it for our Fibonacci labels. The next custom function here formats our text. So this is for the price values. If I turn on prices, you can see that we now have the prices in brackets. That's what this function here does. And we should probably put a space in there so that you have a space between the Fibonacci values like that. The next custom function here formats our label text. So that's this Fibonacci ratio here. If values is set to, the show levels is set to values, then we show the Fibonacci value. If it's set to percent, then we multiply that Fibonacci ratio by 100 and add a percentage sign on the end. And that gives us our Fibonacci ratios as a percentage. I'll leave mine as values for now. The next custom function here checks if price is crossing one of these fib values. So if the price on the current bar is testing one of these Fibonacci values, this custom function will return true. So this code here will check if price has dipped above or below one of these Fibonacci ratios. And this function is used later on to trigger alerts, but we'll get to that in a moment. The next thing we do here is actually calculate our Fibonacci values. So if you've watched the previous lesson on how to manually calculate the Fibonacci values, the code here, the math here is very similar. First, we get our start price and our end price. We use the line get function. This gets the price value of our line. So in this case, on this particular bar, that would be the high of this bar. So end price would be set to the price value at the end of our line, which is this bar's high price here. And start price is set to the starting price of the line. So the line starts from the low here and draws to the high. So our start price would be this bar's low and our end price would be this bar's high, unless reverse is set to true. So if you turn on reverse in the settings menu, it flips these values around. But I'll turn that off because I find reverse Fibonacci's to be a little confusing. Not sure why you would use them, but I'm sure there are reasons to. The next thing we do is calculate the price difference between our starting price and our ending price. That's what this diff value is. And then once we have these values, all of these values here, we can use these to calculate our Fibonacci price in the next custom function here, which is called process level. And this function, this custom function, processes the given Fibonacci level by calculating the fib, drawing the line and label for each fib, detecting alerts, so if one of these Fibonacci levels is being tested by price action, and it also fills the background color of our chart between the last fib. So each fib is filled between to get the background color here. If you set background transparency to 100%, that will get rid of those background fills. Let's set that back to 85 and break down this custom function. So here we have if show is set to true, and this show value is determined by if the value is ticked. So if I tick that on, you can see it's now showing an extra Fibonacci level there. If I turn it off, it goes away. That's what this parameter is for. So if show is true, Then this code gets executed. We calculate our Fibonacci price using this formula here, this mathematical formula. Then we get our line ID by calling our draw fib line function from up here, this guy here, that draws the line. Once we have our line ID, we can then draw our label. So that draws the text label next to the Fibonacci line, and that's this function here. Then we check if price is crossing the current Fibonacci line that this function is processing. If price has crossed that line, then we trigger an alert that says auto fib plus the ticker ID. So in this case, that would be ADA USDT is crossing a level, and then it passes in the Fibonacci value that it's crossing. And then the next thing we do here is check if we have a previous Fibonacci line value. If we do have a previous Fibonacci level, then we fill the line between those two levels with the line fill function. So the line fill function takes a current line ID and a previous line ID. So in the case of this lower fib, that would be the lower one, and the 786, that would be these two values here, these two lines. Then it passes in the color. So the color is whatever you've set in the settings menu here, combined with the overall transparency setting. And then once all of this code has been executed and we've processed each Fibonacci level, we return the line ID that we created up here. And then otherwise, if we are not showing this current Fibonacci level, we return the previous line ID, which is what we use to fill between the two lines like I just explained. And then that's pretty much it for this script. The final thing here is we get a whole bunch of user inputs, all the Fibonacci levels from the settings menu. And this is all the same code, all grouped under Fibonacci levels under this little subtitle here. All of this code is just copy and pasted, and the level numbers are changed. None of them have titles because it's obvious what they are. They're Fibonacci ratios. They have a checkbox to turn them on or off, and they have a color parameter here, so you can change the color of each fib if you want to. And then once we get all of our Fibonacci user inputs, then we process each Fibonacci level one by one using the process level function. And this function here basically combines everything above it. All of this code here that we just went over is processed for each Fibonacci level, but only once a significant pivot is detected. So this script combines pivot detection with Fibonacci calculation. It's quite an advanced script actually, just in terms of all the layers it has and how fleshed out it is in terms of its drawing capabilities and everything, all of the formatting, the settings menu. It's quite a powerful script, not a hell of a lot of code considering what it does. But anyway, that's it for this lesson. That is how the AutoFib script works. Again, the best way to understand what this code is doing is to do what I did, which is copy this source code into your editor and just play around with some of the values. For example, maybe you want to try drawing a horizontal line at the pivot high and pivot low to try and isolate exactly where in the code the pivot high and pivot low prices are detected. And then you could reverse engineer how the script detects pivot points for any other use case you might have for analyzing impulsive moves in price action. And then if I get out of my bar replay tool and we cycle through some markets, you can see the tool at work. Again, it's not perfect. It is going to miss some impulsive moves. Some of you might draw the fib from this swing low to this swing high, for example. But this script requires a decent deviation from the previous swing low or swing high in order to consider it a major move in the market. Anyway, this lesson is long enough. I'll wrap this up here. The source code will be below, as always. I hope you found this breakdown interesting. I hope you find the source code interesting, and I will speak with you in the next lesson. Take care.